Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that'll make your toes curl just from imagining it. How Civil War soldiers endured the brutal cold. And, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you are plopped down in their camps with nothing but your modern hoodie and a half-charged phone. Before we get into the misery though, I've got to do the ritual YouTube thing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love picturing someone bundled up in Chicago at midnight, or wide awake in Texas while I'm talking about Frostbite from the 1860s. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping into a raw December night in 1861. The war is still young, but already thousands of men are discovering that combat isn't the only thing trying to kill them. The air cuts sharper than a bayonet, slipping under the wool of your coat and biting at your skin. Picture soldiers huddled in thin tents pitched on half-frozen mud. The ground isn't solid snow yet. It's that mushy, miserable mix of water and ice, the kind that seeps through boots until your socks squish with every step. And the soldiers, both Union and Confederate, are realizing something. Their government didn't exactly hand out Arctic survival kits, along with their muskets. The first historical fact worth noting, during the winter of 1861-62, many regiments still lacked standardized uniforms. That meant half the men wore threadbare hand-me-downs from state militias, or whatever scraps they'd brought from home. It wasn't uncommon to see someone in half Union blue and half civilian flannel shirt, a patchwork look that said, yes, I'm freezing, and yes, fashion is dead. In fact, supply chains weren't even fully set up, so a soldier might receive a musket before he ever saw a real army coat. That delay translated to nights of trying to sleep in the open air with nothing but a blanket if you were lucky, or with your greatcoat balled up under your head as a pillow while the frost crept up your sleeves. Now for the quirky side. You'd think soldiers would at least find comfort in their tents, but many swore those thin canvas sheets made the cold worse. There are accounts of men describing the tent as a cold box that trapped damp air inside, leaving them to sleep on frost-covered blankets. Some soldiers actually preferred sleeping out in the open by a fire rather than being zipped into a kind of medieval refrigerator. A few inventive guys even cut small slits into their tents to let smoke from fires slip through, basically turning their temporary shelters into half-functional chimneys. Sure, they risked burning the canvas down, but when your toes feel like icicles about to snap off, fire safety isn't exactly top of mind. Scholars still debate the psychological effect of that first winter on the morale of Civil War troops. Was the shock of the cold more demoralizing than the battles themselves? Some historians argue yes, because so many men deserted during winter months, sneaking back home under the excuse of visiting family for Christmas. Others suggest that soldiers who survived those first harsh weeks built a kind of resilience that carried them through the rest of the war. Either way, the winter environment acted like a filter, sorting out who could endure the suffering and who simply couldn't. Imagine yourself crouched by a sputtering fire. Sparks fly up into the black night, briefly illuminating the pale faces of other men, each one wrapped in whatever cloth he can find, wool scarves, worn socks pulled over hands, even burlap sacks draped like cloaks. The ground beneath is cold and wet, and when you shift to find comfort, it feels like your bones creak with the earth. Someone coughs, the sound ragged and raw, echoing against the trees. The officer tries to joke about how it's just a little nip in the air, but his teeth are chattering so loud you can barely hear him. What does warmth mean in this setting? It means holding your tin cup of coffee, if you can call it coffee, so close to your lips that you almost scald your mouth just for the chance to thaw your tongue. It means pressing your body as close to the fire as you dare, even though the back of you is still frozen solid. It means staring into that flame and praying it doesn't burn out, because once it does, the night becomes endless. The first nights out there feel like a cruel joke. You'd thought war was going to be gunfire and trumpet calls, maybe even glory, but instead your glory is standing ankle deep in icy mud, holding your rifle like a walking stick and wishing for the sun. Around you, the camp groans, men tossing, muttering, or lying perfectly still because their bodies have given up shivering. That's the dangerous part. When the shivering stops, you know the cold has sunk too deep. The thing is, even with misery this thick in the air, you hear laughter now and then. Soldiers crack jokes about sleeping with the angels when frost settles on their beards, or they dare each other to touch their tongues to frozen metal. It's absurd, almost childish, but it's a lifeline. The cold might have stolen comfort, but it hadn't completely taken away the spark of mischief that soldiers carried with them. And you know that somewhere, someone in the camp is thinking, if we can laugh at this, maybe we can survive it. So here you are, caught in this first wave of winter. The reality is set in, battles are on hold, but the war hasn't paused at all. The enemy tonight isn't across the field, it's the icy air cutting into every soldier's lungs, daring them to quit. The first winter hits like a hammer, and now you're realizing that what you wear may decide whether you wake up tomorrow. You glance around camp and see the wide, uneven patchwork of uniforms, or what passes for them. The lucky few are wrapped in thick, government-issued wool coats, the kind that at least keep out some of the chill. But most of the others, maybe even you, are wearing whatever rags you managed to drag along from home. A checked flannel shirt here, a patched-up farm jacket there, and plenty of trousers so thin the wind whistles right through them. The Civil War wasn't a fashion show, but it definitely made a mockery of uniform when half the army looked like scarecrows pulled out of cornfields. Here's the historical kicker. The Union Army was much better at distributing standard wool uniforms than the Confederates ever were. The North had more textile mills, more supply lines, and more railroads to ship coats to camps. Confederate soldiers often went weeks or months waiting for replacements, and by then, clothing was shredded by marching, mud, and musket smoke. Diaries from Southern troops describe men wrapping themselves in old carpets, or even curtains stripped from burned houses. One private joked that he looked like a runaway actor in a bad play. Imagine standing in the snow wearing your mum's drapes because the government can't deliver a jacket. The quirky bit comes from soldiers improvising with fabric in ways you'd never expect. Some cut the lining from old saddle blankets to stitch into coats. Others tied rags around their heads, creating what one observer described as a parade of frozen mummies. In desperate moments, they wore feed sacks or even wallpaper pasted onto cloth for extra insulation. Yes, wallpaper. You picture some poor soul trudging through Virginia mud with floral printed trousers, looking like he escaped a living room. That's dedication, or humiliation, depending on how you frame it. But historians still debate just how much the uniform crisis shaped the early phases of the war. Did better northern clothing directly translate into survival rates during winter encampments? Or were disease, food shortages, and overall camp hygiene far more decisive than whether you had wool or cotton on your back? Some argue the clothing shortage was exaggerated in soldier letters, since complaining about conditions was a kind of morale outlet. Others insist that frostbite cases and desertion numbers prove the fabric literally made the difference between life and death. No consensus, just a pile of anecdotes, and your imagination filling in the frostbitten gaps. Picture yourself trying to sleep. You lie down on the cold ground, pulling your thin coat over your chest. The seams are fraying, threads scratching at your skin, but it's all you've got. A buddy next to you is luckier. He's got one of the new government-issue coats, the thick blue wool that almost looks regal in the firelight. You can see steam rising from him as the heat lingers, while your own body just feels like it's giving its warmth back to the earth. It's not jealousy exactly, it's survival envy. The wind shifts, sneaking under your collar, biting at your ears. You wrap a rag around your head like a makeshift scarf, tugging it tight, but the edges keep slipping. When you breathe out, the air fogs instantly, curling into tiny ghosts that hover over your face. You close your eyes and pretend that maybe the blanket your family promised to send will arrive tomorrow. Mail call has become a lottery of warmth. Some men unwrap thick quilts, others open boxes of socks, and some get nothing but stale cookies that taste like home but do nothing against frost. The army itself tries to regulate who wears what, but winter doesn't care about regulations. Commanders scold men for ruining uniformity with their homemade gear, but then they sneak an extra scarf under their own coats when no one's watching. Out in the lines, it's every man for himself. If you find a scrap of cloth, you wear it. If you see an abandoned coat on the roadside, you grab it. Some say winter turns soldiers into scavengers long before hunger does. And then comes the long march. Imagine tramping for miles in boots that are too thin, your coat already stiff with frozen sweat. The fabric rubs at your skin, raw spots forming along your arms and shoulders. Each step feels like hauling a wet sack of grain. Some soldiers deliberately ditch their heavy wool, convinced that mobility matters more than the insulation. They regret it the first time the campfire dies down and the night sinks below freezing. But let's not forget, some men actually preferred lighter clothes. They swore wool was itchy, smelly, and trapped dampness that only made the cold worse. A few even argued that constant movement kept you warmer than a heavy coat ever could. Maybe that's bravado talking, or maybe it's true. When you're stomping through mud and snow, the friction at least keeps your blood moving. But still, when you settle in at night, there's no movement to save you. Just the thin cloth, the bitter air, and the gnawing thought that you'll never be warm again. You curl tighter, tucking your chin into your chest. Somewhere out in the darkness, a horse whinnies, steam rolling from its nostrils like a furnace you wish you could sit beside. Your coat smells like smoke, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of tobacco that someone spilled in the pocket weeks ago. It's not much, but it's yours, and for tonight it's the only barrier between you and the endless winter. The night stretches on, and in the middle of camp, the only thing standing between you and the cold is fire. But fire is a tricky companion. On one hand, it's warmth, light, and a spot to huddle around when your bones feel like icicles. On the other hand, it's a glowing beacon that screams to enemy scouts, "Hey, over here, we're freezing and vulnerable." Fires become both saviours and traitors, as soldiers argue over how big they should be, where to build them, or whether to risk one at all. Historically, commanders were well aware of the fire dilemma. During the early winters of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate officers often issued strict orders. No large fires after dark. Why? Because the orange flicker of flames could be seen for miles, and artillery crews didn't need much else to know where to lob their shells. Yet soldiers weren't exactly enthusiastic about shivering in total darkness. Diaries reveal countless entries where men ignored the rules and snuck tiny fires anyway, digging shallow pits in the earth to keep embers glowing low, covering flames with sticks and dirt until they looked more like smouldering ghosts than roaring bonfires. The quirky part: soldiers sometimes competed with each other over who could build the best fire. Think of it like a survivalist version of a cook-off. Some men swore by pyramid-shaped stacks of wood, others made trench fires that tunneled smoke out at odd angles, and a few creative geniuses tried mixing green wood with dry just to get different burn times. One Union soldier bragged in a letter home that his fire could last all night without stoking, his secret. Borrowing fence rails from a nearby farm, essentially tearing down someone's property for warmth. In fact, fences were stripped across Virginia and Tennessee, whole landscapes left looking like toothless grins, because soldiers couldn't resist free firewood. There's still scholarly debate about how critical campfires were to survival. Some historians argue that warmth wasn't the primary benefit, morale was. A fire gave men a place to gather, tell stories, and pretend for a while that life was normal. Others claim fires were life-saving in literal terms, preventing frostbite and pneumonia that could have wiped out regiments faster than bullets. And then there's the darker side. Too many fires meant too much smoke. And too much smoke meant exposure to lung damage long before the word respiratory health existed in military manuals. Was the fire a comfort or a silent killer? Scholars can't quite agree. You imagine yourself crouched near one of these fires, the flames crackle, sending sparks up into the night sky. Your hands hover over the heat, and for the first time all day, you can actually feel your fingers again. The orange light paints your comrades' faces hollow-eyed and scruffy-bearded, but there's a flicker of life in their eyes. Someone tells a joke about the cold making men as stiff as bayonets, and laughter bursts out in ragged waves. It doesn't matter that your socks are still wet or that your boots smell like death. You're warm, at least for now. But then comes the order. A sharp voice cuts through the circle. "Douse it!" You watch as someone shovels dirt onto the fire, the glow fading to ash. The warmth vanishes in seconds like a cruel trick. Suddenly the night swallows you again, and the cold presses in twice as hard, as if punishing you for daring to fight it. You wrap your coat tighter, but it feels like nothing more than paper against the wind. The ground is damp beneath you, the smell of smoke still clinging to your sleeves. That scent is both a comfort and a tease. It reminds you of warmth, but it doesn't give you any. Some men rebel in quiet ways. A handful sneak off to light small fires at the edge of camp, crouching like conspirators. Others bury glowing coals under their blankets, hoping for a slow burn of warmth through the night. It works, until someone sets his blanket on fire. Stories spread quickly, a soldier waking up with his bedding in flames, rolling through the mud to put it out while everyone else laughs through their chattering teeth. It's tragic and hilarious all at once, the kind of absurdity that only a frozen battlefield can produce. And then there's the quiet magic of the fire itself. For a few minutes, when the flames are high, you forget the war, you forget the frost, the hunger, and even the danger. You just sit there, mesmerised by the dance of light on wood, as sparks spiral upward like fireflies. You almost feel like you're back home, staring at a hearth in a farmhouse, safe and warm. The illusion doesn't last long, but it's enough to carry you through another hour, maybe another night. The enemy's fires sometimes appear on the horizon too. Tiny pinpricks of orange glow across the field, a silent reminder that men on the other side are just as cold, just as desperate, and just as human. It's eerie, seeing your enemy's fire like a mirror of your own suffering. You wonder if they're laughing right now, telling jokes, or just staring into the embers, wishing for spring. So the fire burns, dies, and burns again. It's a fragile lifeline, both risk and relief, a balancing act of survival that keeps you alive while constantly threatening to betray you. And as you curl up in the dark, smoke still stinging your eyes, you realise one truth. In this war, warmth is never free. By the time the fires flicker out and the camp settles, you're left inside what the army generously calls a tent. Really, it's nothing more than a triangle of canvas propped up by poles, thin as parchment and just as good at stopping wind. When the first gust slices through the fabric, you realise the truth. This thing isn't a shelter, it's a sieve. The snowflakes don't fall outside, they drift right in through the cracks, landing on your blanket and melting cold trails down your neck. The officers called these shelter tents. Soldiers had other names for them, dog tents being the most polite. The historical fact here is worth pausing on. Early in the war, many troops carried no personal tents at all. Whole regiments might be issued a single large marquee for officers, while enlisted men made do with brush huts or, worse, the open sky. By 1862, the Union began issuing the infamous shelter half. 2 soldiers buttoned their halves together to make a single pup tent. It sounded clever in the manual, but in practice the canvas was so low you could barely crawl in, and so thin you might as well lie under a damp bedsheet. Confederate supply shortages made things even bleaker. Many southern camps had no tents, leaving soldiers to dig holes in the ground and roof them with logs or branches. Basically, half the army was camping like broke Boy Scouts. And here comes the quirky part. Some soldiers decorated their tents like miniature homes. They'd carve initials into the poles, hang tin cups like ornaments, or even try stitching scraps of coloured cloth to make little flags flutter in the icy breeze. One soldier bragged that he painted his canvas with berry juice to keep spirits up, though it turned the tent sticky and smelled like spoiled wine for weeks. Others stretched out stolen wallpaper inside for insulation, so that, yes, some tents came to look like cosy parlours plopped down in muddy fields. Imagine trying to look dignified in battle while sleeping in a flowery Victorian wallpaper cave. But historians still wrestle with a bigger question. Did the army truly underestimate how brutal winter would be, or did they simply not care? Some argue the tents were never meant for warmth, only portability. Soldiers weren't supposed to live in them for months on end, yet campaigns dragged on, trapping men in makeshift fabric prisons. Others suggest that harsh conditions weren't a mistake at all, but part of the military mindset. Cold weeded out the weak. Either way, the debate circles back to the same problem. You can't fight a war if you freeze to death first. Now picture yourself crawling into one of these tents. The ground is wet, the canvas already damp from melted frost. You try to spread your blanket, but it soaks through immediately, leaving you lying in a puddle that feels like an ice bath. Your buddy squeezes in beside you, both of you pressed shoulder to shoulder, knees tucked into your chests. There's no room to roll over, barely space to breathe without brushing your nose against cold fabric. Outside, the wind rattles the tent like a drum, and every snap of canvas feels like a reminder that the elements are stronger than you. Inside, the air grows heavy. The smell is part smoke, part sweat, part mud-soaked wool. Your breath condenses on the canvas, dripping down in tiny rivulets that trace icy trails onto your face. You try to shift to find a patch of dry ground, but the whole tent feels like sleeping inside a damp sock. Someone sneezes, then coughs, the sound muffled but contagious in the stale air. Disease spreads quickly in these little fabric coffins. Pneumonia, dysentery, you name it. You're not just fighting the cold anymore, you're fighting the company of dozens of bodies trapped in the same miserable shelter design. And yet, for all the misery, the tent still means survival. Without it, you'd be exposed to the full bite of the night. At least the canvas takes the edge off the wind. At least you're not snowed over completely. And at least when you huddle close enough to feel another man's ribs pressing against yours, you know you're not alone in this frozen hell. There are moments of strange comfort too. You lie there, staring at the faint glow of moonlight bleeding through this canvas, listening to the creaks and groans of men shifting in their sleep. You hear whispered prayers, muttered curses, and the occasional absurd joke tossed into the dark. Sometimes the tent becomes not just a shelter, but a shared confession booth, where fear and hope spill out because no one can escape. It's not much, but in the middle of war it's something. So the canvas walls flap, the snow creeps in, and the cold digs deep. You're not warm, not dry, and not comfortable, but you're alive. And in this war, that counts as a victory. Morning comes, and the first thing you notice isn't the light. It's your feet, or rather, the lack of feeling in them. You wiggle your toes and it's like trying to move stones at the bottom of a river. When you finally swing your legs out of the tent, you realise your boots are frozen stiff, curled in odd shapes like they'd been petrified overnight. Some men don't even have boots at all. They step into the snow barefoot, their skin red and raw, as if the cold has been gnawing on them all night long. You glance down at your own pair, cracked along the seams, the soles so thin you might as well be walking directly on the ice. This is the part of the war no one ever mentioned, the war against your own shoes. Historically, it's shocking how underprepared the armies were for basic footwear. The Union Army churned out shoes from northern factories, but demand often outpaced supply, leaving thousands without replacements for months. Confederate soldiers were worse off. Southern leather supplies dwindled quickly, and whole regiments marched with bare or wrapped feet. Diaries describe soldiers cutting strips of rawhide, wrapping them around their feet, and tying them with string until they hardened into makeshift shoes. Of course, when it rained or snowed, the rawhide froze solid, so you'd basically be walking on 2 blocks of ice. One Confederate remarked he would sooner walk on nails than endure another winter march in those contraptions. Now, for the quirky part, some soldiers stuffed their boots with corn husks or straw, a farmer's trick to keep the cold out. Others tucked newspaper into the soles for insulation. And then there were the ones who decided to go barefoot intentionally, believing calloused feet made them tougher. Spoiler, it didn't. Many of these barefoot warriors ended up hobbling with frostbite, their toes blackened and swollen. There are even accounts of soldiers tying gunny sacks around their feet and filling them with horse manure, hoping the heat would last through the night. Not exactly glamorous, but in the ranking of gross but life-saving, it kind of worked. At least until the smell drove everyone else in the tent crazy. Scholars debate just how much poor footwear influenced the outcome of campaigns. Some argue that the winter march attrition, the sheer number of soldiers sidelined by frostbite, was just as damaging as battlefield losses. Others counter that most armies were equally miserable, so it balanced out. What can't be denied is that bad shoes literally slowed the pace of war. Entire regiments limped instead of marched. Officers begged quartermasters for shipments of boots, sometimes delaying offensives for weeks. Was the Confederacy's failing supply system most visible in its bare feet? That question still keeps military historians arguing. Now you put yourself in that soldier's place. You lace up your boots. The leather stiff and brittle. The lace is frozen into knots that bite your fingers as you tug. When you finally force your foot in, it feels like sliding into a block of wood. The sock inside is damp, icy against your skin, and no amount of stamping on the ground gets the blood flowing. As the day begins, you march along, each step stabbing through your soles as if the earth itself has teeth. You try to ignore it, focusing instead on the rhythm of drums or the shuffle of comrades beside you, but the pain keeps clawing back. After hours of trudging, blisters form, then burst. The raw skin rubs against stiff leather, every step a reminder that you're falling apart from the ground up. Some men drop to the roadside, peeling off their boots to reveal swollen feet. mottled purple and blue. Others press forward out of sheer stubbornness, limping like wounded animals but refusing to stop. You pass abandoned shoes in the mud, discarded because they were too broken to serve even one more mile. They sit there like little gravestones, silent markers of how much the cold has already claimed. At night, you peel your boots off again, wincing at the smell of damp leather and sour sweat. You hold your feet close to the fire, watching steam curl off your socks. The relief is almost unbearable. It stings, burns, and then finally eases as warmth seeps back in, but you know it won't last. By morning, the cycle starts again. Frozen boots, numb toes, another day of grinding pain, and you realize with a grim laugh that your enemy isn't just across the field with rifles, it's right here gnawing at your feet. The absurdity is almost comic. You signed up to fight for your country, your cause, maybe even glory. Instead, you're losing the war to your boots, and yet here you are, still marching, still enduring, because the alternative is worse, stopping, surrendering, or letting the cold finally win. So you grit your teeth, adjust the rags stuffed in your shoe, and take another step. One more mile, one more night, and maybe, just maybe, the quartermaster will come through before your feet give out completely. The boots may be falling apart, but the real battlefield today isn't leather, it's firewood. You look around camp and every soldier is suddenly a scavenger, eyes darting toward fence lines, barns, even nearby orchards. Wood is survival currency. Without it, your fire sputters out, your coffee stays cold, and your body stiffens into something better suited for a morgue. Every dawn begins the same way. Men grabbing axes, saws, or just bare hands, fanning out like desperate lumberjacks in search of something that'll burn. Here's the historical fact. Civil War camps stripped landscapes bare within weeks. Soldiers cut down entire groves of trees, tore apart fences rail by rail, and even dismantled houses if they had the chance. Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia especially bear scars from this war for firewood. Farmers who returned to their land often found their fences gone, barns reduced to skeletons, and orchards hacked into stumps. Officers tried issuing orders against such destruction, but freezing soldiers rarely cared about property rights. One Union private summed it up. Warmth now, consequences later. And then there's the quirky side of wood collecting. Some men became proud wood thieves, bragging about how stealthily they could steal from barns or sheds without alerting nearby civilians. Others turned it into a competition. Who could haul back the biggest log, or who could sneak off with fence rails under an officer's nose? There are accounts of soldiers carrying entire doors or wagon parts just to throw them on the fire. One group even burned captured enemy wagons, laughing that they'd won the war with a warm night's sleep. Civilian complaints piled up, but by then their fences were already in smoke. Scholars still debate how much this firewood scavenging shaped civilian attitudes toward the armies occupying their land. Did it push neutral farmers into supporting one side over the other? Some argue the wanton destruction fueled resentment, especially toward Union troops marching through the South. Others believe civilians, while angry, tolerated it because they understood the soldiers' desperation. After all, no one wants to watch men freeze to death. The debate hangs on. Was firewood theft a necessary evil or an unnecessary insult? Now picture yourself out on a wood-gathering run. The snow crunches under your boots as you eye a fence line. The rails look sturdy, thick enough to burn hot for hours. You pull one loose, the frozen wood creaking in protest, then another, until the gap looks like a missing tooth in a smile. Behind you, others are doing the same, dismantling fences in neat chunks like a hungry army of termites. You sling the wood over your shoulder, already imagining the crackle of the fire waiting back at camp. But sometimes, the search turns darker. You stumble on an abandoned farmhouse, the windows shattered, the roof sagging. Inside, chairs and tables sit dusty and broken, but to you, they're treasure. You haul out a leg from a chair, a shutter from the wall, even a floorboard if it comes loose. Each piece feels like stealing memories, the ghosts of family dinners and bedtime stories, now destined to vanish in smoke. There's guilt in it, yes, but guilt doesn't keep you warm at night. Back in camp, the fire roars high with your haul, the wood pops and spits, sparks spiraling into the sky. You stretch your hands out, sighing in relief as heat seeps through your fingers. Around you, men brag about their finds. Got a whole barn beam, one laughs. Another proudly displays a tabletop turned into fuel. The smell of burning pine mixes with damp wool and tobacco smoke. A strange perfume of survival, yet the wood never lasts long. A single night consumes what took hours to find. By morning, the ashes scatter, and the hunger for firewood begins again. The cycle is endless, chewing through the countryside just as relentlessly as the armies chew through each other. And as you watch sparks float into the black sky, you know tomorrow you'll be back at it, tearing down another fence, another orchard, another memory of what this land used to be. Because in this war, fire isn't just comfort, it's the line between life and frostbitten death. And for that line, you'll pull down every fence from here to Richmond if it means you get to see the sunrise again. When the scavenged wood is gone and the fire dwindles to embers, your thoughts turn towards something softer, warmer, and infinitely rarer than fence rails, quilts from home. In the harsh churn of winter, a package arriving from family feels like a small miracle. You picture it, the rough brown wrapping paper, the string tied just tight enough, your name scrawled across it in familiar handwriting. The moment the box touches your hands, the whole camp seems to lean closer, as if everyone is waiting to see what treasure you've been granted. Here's the historical fact. Families, churches, and relief organisations across both North and South sent countless blankets and quilts to soldiers during the war. Women stitched them in sewing circles, often inscribing names, Bible verses, or patriotic slogans into the fabric. Union soldiers sometimes received sanitary commission packages, while Confederate troops relied heavily on local communities, who poured their dwindling resources into every stitch. These quilts weren't just bedding, they were literal lifelines. Wrapped in one, a soldier could endure nights that otherwise might have left him frozen and stiff by dawn. The quirky angle comes in with the designs. Some quilts were downright flamboyant, stitched with bright patches of leftover fabric, giving them a carnival look against the drab greys and blues of military life. Others carried secret messages. Union women sewed stars and stripes into patterns, while Southern women slipped Confederate symbols into their handiwork. There are even stories of crazy quilts, mismatched and stitched in wild shapes, because women used whatever scraps they had left after years of shortages. One soldier wrote home that his quilt looked like a rooster exploded on the fabric, but he loved it because it smelled faintly of home. That smell, the faint trace of soap, wood smoke, or lavender, was sometimes as powerful as the warmth. And then comes the debate among historians. Were quilts truly functional, or more symbolic? Some scholars argue quilts rarely reach the front in usable condition, damp, worn, or stolen en route. Others insist soldiers treasured them above all else, citing letters where men describe clutching quilts even during marches. Was it warmth that mattered most, or the connection to family stitched into the fabric? The answer likely depends on the soldier, but either way a quilt was more than just cloth. Imagine receiving one yourself. You open the package and pull out a heavy quilt, patched with bits of old dresses and shirts. The colours are faded, but you recognise patterns. Your mother's apron here, your sister's Sunday dress there, maybe even a scrap from the curtain that used to hang in the kitchen. Your hands tremble as you unfold it, the fabric softer than anything the army has ever given you. The scent hits first, faint, like home carried across hundreds of miles. You press your face into it, the smell instantly dragging you back to memories of hearth fires and crowded family suppers. For a moment you forget the mud, the smoke, and the gnawing cold. That night, wrapped in the quilt, the difference is staggering. Instead of shivering endlessly, you feel warmth slowly seeping through your body, spreading like liquid comfort into your bones. Your buddies crowd around, teasing you about your fancy house blanket, but they all lean close, hoping to steal a bit of warmth when you're not looking. You pretend to guard it fiercely, but in the end, you share. Because in camp, everything is shared. Of course, not every soldier was so lucky. Many men went through the war without ever receiving a quilt, relying instead on army-issue blankets, thin, scratchy, and often crawling with lice. You see those men eyeing your quilt with longing and you feel both guilty and grateful. The war has taken almost everything from you. But for now, this quilt is proof you're still tethered to the world outside the battlefield. As you lie there, the fabric wrapped tight around you, you wonder how many other soldiers are doing the same across the countryside, clutching scraps of home against the dark. You picture thousands of quilts stretched out over thousands of weary bodies, little islands of colour and comfort in a sea of mud and snow. And in that thought, there's something soothing. You're not alone in your suffering. Somewhere, in another campfire circle, another man is sighing into his quilt, dreaming of a home just like you. And so the quilt becomes more than warmth. It's a memory, a shield, a promise that someone still cares whether you freeze or not. Tomorrow the war will go on, but tonight, wrapped in fabric stitched by familiar hands, you sleep a little easier, knowing that love can travel farther than the cold. The quilt might keep you warm at night, but by morning someone inevitably passes around a canteen with a sharper kind of heat. Whiskey. Soldiers swear by it, calling it liquid warmth, the cure for frozen bones and miserable nights. You take a sip and it burns down your throat, spreading a false glow through your chest. For a moment you feel invincible, convinced that maybe the cold isn't so bad after all. But soon enough the warmth fades, and the shiver creeps back in. Still, the canteen keeps circling, because hope, no matter how temporary, tastes better than frost. Historically, whiskey was everywhere during the Civil War. The Union Army issued rations of it in the early months, though by 1862 officials tried to replace it with coffee, believing booze led to more trouble than benefit. The Confederates, with far fewer resources, leaned heavily on homemade liquor, moonshine brewed from corn, peaches, or whatever grain farmers could spare. Soldiers often bought whiskey from sutlers, the camp merchants who sold at inflated prices, and when money ran out, men bartered, coffee beans for a gulp, tobacco for a sip. Some surgeons even prescribed whiskey for frostbite and hypothermia, convinced it boosted circulation. The quirky part? Not all whiskey was what it claimed to be. Sutlers sometimes watered it down, spiced it with red pepper, or even mixed in turpentine or kerosene to stretch the supply. Soldiers joked about drinking rock guts strong enough to fuel a locomotive. Others added molasses or fruit to disguise the taste. There are accounts of soldiers experimenting with odd brews, apple whiskey, persimmon beer, even potato coffee spiked with grain alcohol. Desperation breeds creativity, even if the result tastes like poison. And here's where historians still argue: did whiskey help or hurt soldiers in the cold? On one hand, alcohol dilates blood vessels, giving that fleeting rush of warmth, which might help morale. On the other hand, the science is cruel. Alcohol actually makes the body lose heat faster, leaving soldiers more vulnerable. Some scholars argue whiskey saved more lives through morale than it cost in frostbite. Others insist it did nothing but cloud judgment and ruin discipline. Was it medicine or madness? The debate burns almost as hot as the liquor itself. Now imagine yourself with that tin cup of whiskey. You cradle it in numb hands, the smell sharp and biting in the cold air. The first sip makes your eyes water, but the fire in your chest is undeniable. Around you, men laugh louder, sing rough songs, and clap each other on the back as if the cold has been beaten for good. For a little while, the camp feels alive, voices rising in off-key choruses, boots stomping in rhythm, the misery drowned out by drunken cheer. But the glow doesn't last. The fire burns out, the cold creeps back in, and some men slump against trees, too drunk to notice their fingers stiffening in the frost. One soldier passes out, snoring in the snow, until his buddies drag him closer to the fire before he freezes solid. Another starts a drunken argument that ends with fists flying, blood steaming as it hits the icy ground. Warmth has a price, and sometimes the price is chaos. The irony isn't lost on you. Whiskey promises to make you strong against the cold, but really it makes you weaker, slower, less alert. Still, when the night stretches long and the tent feels like a coffin, you know you'll reach for it again. Because sometimes the lie of warmth is better than the truth of freezing, and so the canteen keeps making its rounds, passed from hand to hand like a secret. You drink, you laugh, you stumble, and you shiver. The cold always wins in the end, but for a few minutes whiskey makes you believe you've beaten it. And belief, in a winter camp, might be the strongest medicine of all. Whiskey might dull the edge of the cold for a while, but when the fire dies and the tents turn into frost-covered coffins, you need a more reliable trick: huddling. Soldiers call it stacking like logs, and that's exactly what it feels like. Row after row of exhausted men lying pressed against each other, hoping body heat will do what blankets and whiskey can't. At first it feels awkward, like you've wandered into a barnyard pile of puppies. But as the night stretches on, the warmth begins to spread, and suddenly the closeness isn't strange at all. It's survival. The historical fact here is that this tactic wasn't just folklore. It was common practice in both Union and Confederate camps. Soldiers wrote about spooning in groups of 2, 3, even whole rows of men lying shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes they'd dig shallow pits in the ground, line them with straw or leaves, and climb in together like human sardines. Officers didn't always approve, but most looked the other way, knowing men had to do whatever it took to survive long winter nights. Even generals mentioned in their memoirs that their troops looked like bundles of sticks stacked for burning when the cold set in. The quirky part: huddling often led to unexpected friendships or resentments. Some soldiers swore by sleeping partners, men they paired with consistently, trusting each other not to hog the blanket or roll away in the night. Others complained bitterly about snorers, elbow jabbers, or those with less than pleasant odours after weeks without washing. One Confederate soldier joked that the worst part of huddling wasn't the cold, but waking up nose to nose with a fellow who'd eaten onions the day before. Still, the complaints usually took a back seat to the relief of not freezing. Historians continue to debate just how effective this method was. Did huddling genuinely reduce frostbite and hypothermia, or did it mostly provide psychological comfort? Some argue it was life-saving, citing medical records that show fewer severe cold weather cases among men who bunk together. Others claim the practice actually spread disease faster, measles, smallpox and pneumonia moving from body to body in the crowded piles. Was the risk of sickness worth the warmth? It's one of those wartime trade-offs that scholars still chew over. Now put yourself there. You crawl into the narrow tent, dragging your damp blanket with you. There's barely enough space to stretch out, but your bunkmate scoots closer, muttering through chattering teeth. Another man presses against your other side, and before long, the whole line of bodies is pressed tight, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, knees tangled like a woven net. The warmth starts slow, almost imperceptible, but then you feel it spreading, heat pooling under the blanket, radiating from every chest and back, until the tent feels almost bearable. It isn't glamorous. Someone snores directly in your ear, another shifts and elbows your ribs, and a third's feet feel like frozen bricks pressed against your calves. The smell is no better. Stale sweat, wet wool, and tobacco breath hanging heavy in the air. But you endure it, because warmth is stronger than pride. And as the night deepens, you stop noticing the discomfort. You're too tired, too grateful to care. There's a strange intimacy in this closeness. By daylight, you're comrades in arms, marching, drilling, joking. By night, you're a human furnace, breathing in sync, sharing the same fragile shield against the cold. It breaks down barriers. Rank matters less when you're shivering together, when even the loudest sergeant curls up quietly beside a private. The cold doesn't care about titles, and neither does body heat. But the danger is always there. If someone rolls away in his sleep, the whole line feels it. A gap opens, the cold seeps in, and suddenly everyone's awake, grumbling, dragging the straggler back into position. It's teamwork at its rawest. If one man gives up, everyone suffers. You cling to each other, not out of affection but necessity. Survival has turned you into a collective body, one giant organism fighting the night with shared heat. And when morning finally comes, the frost still clinging to the canvas above you, you wake in a tangle of limbs, groggy but alive. The camp looks like a field of fallen logs as men untangle themselves, stretch stiff joints, and groan at the aches left behind. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't dignified, but it kept you alive, and in this war that's the only victory that matters when the temperature plunges. By the time the sun crawls up and burns off the frost on the canvas, your stomach is already twisting with hunger. Breakfast should help, but in winter camp, rations turn into their own little ice age nightmare. You pry open the tin of salt pork, only to find the slab as rigid as a brick, white crystals of frost clinging to its greasy edges. The hardtack isn't any better. The crackers, already infamous for being rock hard, freeze overnight into something that feels more like masonry than food. You wrap one against your rifle stock and it sounds like knocking on oak. Welcome to Frozen Dining Civil War Edition. Historically, rations were issued in predictable monotony. Salt pork, hardtack, beans, and the occasional rice or desiccated vegetable if supply trains made it through. Coffee for Union troops, cornmeal for Confederates, and not much else. In warm months, these foods were at least edible with some effort. But in winter, supplies froze solid. Soldiers sometimes had to thaw meat under their armpits or soften hardtack by dunking it in coffee until it crumbled. Still, there were days when food arrived late, half frozen, or spoiled from the journey, leaving soldiers gnawing on frozen hunks of fat or going without entirely. The quirky part? Soldiers got creative with their icy rations. They joked about using frozen pork as paperweights or even weapon substitutes. A good throw could knock a man senseless, one Union private wrote. Hardtack was sometimes carved into playing pieces for checkers or used as writing surfaces for love notes when paper ran short. There are also stories of soldiers staging hardtack duels, trying to see who could bite through the hardest cracker without breaking a tooth. Winners gained bragging rights, losers gained dental problems, but scholars debate the true impact of frozen rations. Did soldiers suffer more from malnutrition or from the psychological strain of endless monotony? Some argue the food shortage directly weakened armies in winter, making them more vulnerable to disease and frostbite. Others insist morale was the bigger issue. Eating the same icy meal day after day drained spirits, even if it technically kept men alive. The line between physical survival and mental endurance is blurry, and the truth probably lies somewhere in both. Now imagine yourself with your breakfast. You pull out a piece of salt pork, your fingers sticking to the frosty fat. You try slicing it with your knife, but the blade skids off, leaving greasy shavings instead of edible pieces. You toss a chunk into your tin cup, hoping it will thaw near the fire, but it just sits there, pale and stubborn. Next comes the hardtack, so stiff you nearly crack a molar on the first bite. Desperate, you dunk it into your lukewarm coffee, watching bubbles rise as the cracker slowly gives way, turning into a mushy paste that tastes faintly of ash and bitterness. It's hardly appetizing, but it fills your stomach, and that's all that matters. Around you, other soldiers wrestle with their meals. One bangs his hardtack on a rock to break it into manageable pieces. Another holds his pork close to the fire only to drop it into the flames, watching his dinner curl and blacken as everyone else laughs. A few men actually enjoy the absurdity, comparing their frozen meals like collectors. Mine's harder than yours. No, mine's been frozen 3 weeks straight. It becomes a competition in misery, with humour as the only seasoning available. The worst nights come when supplies don't arrive at all. Snow blocks the wagons or enemy raids cut off the lines, and suddenly the camp is left scraping the last crumbs from old rations. Men boil leather straps for broth, chew on pine bark, or roast corn stolen from fields. Hunger gnaws as fiercely as the cold, and you realise that in winter, your greatest luxury isn't warmth. It's food you can actually chew. As you swallow the last soggy bite of hardtack, you lean back and breathe out, watching the steam curl from your lips. Your stomach isn't satisfied, but it's quiet for now. And in this war, that's enough to march another mile, fight another day, or simply survive another freezing night. Food may be grim, fires scarce, and boots miserable, but every so often something unexpected stirs camp spirits. A snowball fight. Winter slows campaigns, leaving armies idle for weeks, and boredom is just as dangerous as cold. So when snow piles high enough, soldiers drop their rifles, scoop up fistfuls of powder, and turn the battlefield into a playground. The first snowball whistles through the air, hitting some unsuspecting private square in the back. Then comes retaliation, and before long the entire regiment is lobbing icy missiles like schoolboys cut loose from class. Historically, these snowball battles weren't just minor scuffles. They were massive, organised melees. There are accounts of regiments staging campaigns with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men divided into teams, complete with commanders and battle plans. The Army of Northern Virginia, for instance, staged snowball fights in 1863 that sprawled across open fields, with officers directing charges as men hurled snowballs by the bucketful. Some soldiers claimed these mock battles felt almost as exhausting as real combat, leaving them bruised, breathless, and laughing despite the cold. The quirky fact: snowball fights occasionally turned vicious. Snow packed too tightly became ice hard, and men slipped rocks or buttons inside for extra sting. One Confederate recalled being knocked out cold by a snowball that may as well have been a cannonball. Others wrote about prisoners being dragged to imaginary stockades or generals leading snow cavalry charges astride logs. It was play, yes, but play with the edge of war, discipline, strategy, and sometimes injuries. Scholars debate the meaning behind these battles. Were they pure entertainment, a way to stave off boredom, or did they serve as informal training, honing troops' coordination and endurance when no real campaign was possible? Some argue the snowball wars were essential morale builders, helping soldiers feel human again. Others dismiss them as distractions, dangerous games that left men bruised and exhausted for no gain. The line between play and preparation is still contested. Now put yourself in one of those fights. You crouch low, scooping snow into your numb hands, packing it tight until your fingers ache. Across the field you see the other side massing, their shouts carrying through the crisp winter air. A whistle blows, or maybe it's just a cheer, and the two sides surge forward. Snowballs fly in arcs, smacking into faces, chests, and legs. You take one full in the cheek, the shock of icy powder exploding against your skin, and for a moment you're laughing so hard you forget your body is freezing. The camp transforms. Instead of groans and coughs, you hear laughter, wild and contagious. Men who barely spoke during the march are shouting taunts, chasing each other through drifts, tumbling into the snow with more energy than they've shown in weeks. Officers, at least the ones with humour, look the other way, or join in. For a while, the war feels distant, the enemy nothing more than frost and boredom. You're not a soldier tonight, you're a boy again, flinging snow under a pale sky. But like everything in camp, it doesn't last. Eventually, someone limps back with a swollen eye, another with a split lip, and the reality of war creeps back in. The laughter fades, replaced by shivers as wet clothes stiffen with frost. Fires are lit again, the snow drying into steam, and the camp returns to its weary rhythm. The cold settles back over you like a heavy cloak, reminding you that joy in this place is always fleeting. Still, as you curl under your blanket that night, sore and damp, you can't help smiling. For a few brief hours, the war turned into a snowball carnival, and you remembered what it felt like to be alive, not just surviving. And in the brutal winter of the Civil War, even a snowball fight could mean the difference between despair and endurance. The snow may have left bruises and laughter behind, but as the camp quiets, another kind of endurance takes centre stage. Letters. In the cold, men crave connection as much as warmth, and writing home becomes an act of survival. You sit hunched over a scrap of paper, the ink thick and sluggish from the chill, your fingers trembling so badly that the words trail off in crooked lines. The candle sputters in the draught, threatening to go out, and every sentence feels like chiselling stone rather than writing. Still, you press on, because words are the only bridge back to the world beyond the snow. Historically, letters were lifelines for Civil War soldiers. The postal system, though inconsistent, moved millions of them between camps and home. Soldiers wrote in barns, tents, and under blankets, their ink freezing in bottles and their pens scratching against damp paper. Some even resorted to using gunpowder mixed with water as makeshift ink when supplies ran short. A Union soldier once complained that his pen kept freezing solid, forcing him to thaw it with his breath before each sentence. Despite all obstacles, the flow of letters never stopped. Men wrote about food, battles, boredom, and above all, the cold. The quirky part. Soldiers didn't always write with solemnity. Some decorated their letters with doodles, sketches of snow-covered camps, caricatures of shivering officers, or playful drawings of icicles dangling from tents. Others folded paper into elaborate shapes, sending home snowflake letters as tokens of affection. And when paper ran short, men wrote on whatever they could find: wallpaper scraps, margins of newspapers, or even the backs of old military orders. One Confederate famously scribbled a love note to his fiancée on a piece of cartridge paper, explaining he had no better canvas. Historians still debate the reliability of these frosty letters as sources. Were soldiers exaggerating their misery for sympathy, or were the accounts as bleak as they sound? Some scholars suggest the men often dramatised their suffering, hoping families would appreciate their sacrifice. Others believe the letters were brutally honest, raw dispatches from men stripped to their limits by cold and hunger. Either way, they provide some of the clearest windows into the winter experience, even if filtered through numb fingers and blurred ink. Now imagine yourself with that pen. Your hand shakes so badly that you have to steady it against your knee. The ink in the inkwell is half frozen, thick as syrup, and the nib scratches over the paper like claws. You start with the basics. Dearest mother, my beloved Sarah, and already your fingers ache. Each word takes longer than it should, the letters sprawling unevenly across the page. Sometimes the ink clumps into dark blotches. Sometimes it fades as if the cold itself is erasing your thoughts. You try to describe camp life, the frozen pork, the fires, the huddling, but the words feel too small. How do you capture the way cold gnaws into your bones, or the way laughter still bubbles up in a snowball fight? You leave some things unsaid. Maybe you don't mention the frostbite creeping into your toes, or the man who coughed blood into the snow last night. Instead, you tell them you're fine, that you're holding up, that spring is just around the corner. You imagine the letter warming them the way their quilt warmed you. Around you, other men scratch away at their own scraps of paper. The tent is filled with silence broken only by the scratch of pens, the occasional curse when ink freezes, or the quiet murmur of someone reading his words aloud to make sure they fit. One man folds his letter and kisses it before sealing it. Another scribbles furiously, then tears it up, too embarrassed to send what he wrote. Each letter is part confession, part survival, part prayer. And when the mail finally arrives in return, weeks late, sometimes months, the camp transforms. Men rush to the courier, hands outstretched, faces lighting up at the sight of familiar handwriting. Those who get letters read them aloud again and again, tucking the pages close to their hearts. Those who don't receive any turn away, forcing smiles but carrying a deeper chill inside than any winter wind could bring. So you write, you send, and you wait. The ink may freeze, the words may blur, but the act itself keeps you tethered. Every letter you send is a thread stretching through the cold, tying you to a place that still feels warm, even if you may never see it again. The letters offer warmth for the spirit, but the body is still vulnerable, and winter spares no cruelty. One morning, you wake to find a fellow soldier's toes blackened, swollen, and cracked open like charred wood. Frostbite has claimed him, and the surgeons are already preparing their sores. In camp, everyone whispers about the cold wounds, injuries no enemy fired but just as deadly. Winter turns surgeons into butchers, and soldiers into patients whether or not they ever face a bullet. The historical fact is grim. Frostbite was a constant shadow in Civil War camps. Men stood sentry for hours in freezing winds, their feet locked in frozen boots, fingers clinging to rifles until skin peeled away. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by gunshot wounds and disease, filled with frostbite cases every winter. Amputations weren't uncommon. Surgeons lopped off toes, feet, even hands ruined by gangrene. Unlike battlefield surgery, frostbite felt preventable, which made the loss sting worse. Soldiers wrote home with shame, calling frostbite a coward's wound, even though it came simply from standing too long in the wrong weather. The quirky, almost absurd detail. Soldiers invented all kinds of remedies for frostbite. Some rubbed snow directly on frozen skin, thinking the cold-on-cold treatment would heal it. Spoiler, it didn't. Others smeared bacon grease, turpentine, or even whiskey onto blackened toes, believing the sting meant it was working. One Confederate doctor recommended soaking frozen feet in kerosene. There are accounts of men shoving their feet close enough to campfires to scorch their boots, desperate for heat. Sometimes they saved themselves. Sometimes they walked away burned and crippled. Historians debate how much frostbite truly impacted the war. Was it a major medical crisis, crippling regiments, or just an unpleasant footnote compared to smallpox and dysentery? Some scholars argue frostbite claimed fewer lives but had an outsized psychological toll. Soldiers feared the creeping numbness more than bullets. Others suggest amputations from frostbite were exaggerated in post-war memoirs, the horror growing larger in memory than in reality. The truth likely lies between. Frostbite wasn't the deadliest threat, but it was a constant, humiliating one that eroded morale. Now place yourself in that surgeon's tent. The smell hits first: smoke, sweat, and the sour stench of rot. A soldier lies on the table, his foot black and stiff, toes curled like burned twigs. The surgeon lifts a saw, his breath fogging in the cold air. There's no chloroform left, so two men hold the patient down while he screams, his voice echoing through the camp. The saw rasps, slow and deliberate, until the ruined foot drops into a bucket. The stump is wrapped in cloth, and the man is left shivering, alive but less than he was yesterday. Back in the tent, you stare at your own feet, flexing your toes, wondering if they'll betray you. They're numb already, the skin pale and stiff. You rub them with your hands, trying to coax warmth back in, but the fear lingers. Every soldier in camp has heard the stories. Men who woke up to find their fingers black, men who hobbled for weeks only to collapse into the surgeon's arms. Some laugh about it, making jokes that the snow collects its tax, but the laughter is brittle. Everyone knows the cold doesn't joke back. At night the talk turns dark. A buddy whispers about a soldier who fell asleep on sentry duty and never woke. Frozen solid, standing like a statue until they dragged him down. Another tells of a man who ignored the pain in his toes until he could peel the skin away in sheets. These aren't stories from battles. They're campfire tales of the war against winter itself. And you know, deep down, that your enemy tonight isn't carrying a rifle. It's crawling into your boots, creeping into your bones, and waiting for you to close your eyes. So you double your socks, you rub your hands raw, you press your feet against the fire until sparks sting your skin. Because if you don't, tomorrow you might wake to find yourself missing a piece of who you are, and the surgeon's saw won't ask permission. If frostbite turns the cold into a slow thief, then sentry duty makes it a torturer. Nothing compares to being ordered to stand guard in the dead of night, musket in hand, while the rest of camp huddles under blankets. You step into the dark, your boots crunching on frozen ground, and take your post. The wind slices across your face like invisible blades, carrying with it the hiss of trees and the faint creak of the ice on branches. You shift from one foot to the other, trying to keep blood moving, but the cold creeps in anyway, curling into your bones. Historically, sentry duty in winter was one of the most dreaded assignments. Armies required men on watch, 24/7, no matter the weather, which meant hours of immobility and brutal temperatures. Union and Confederate soldiers alike recorded stories of comrades found stiff and dead at their posts, muskets still clutched in their hands. Regulations demanded alertness, yet frostbite and hypothermia often struck faster than enemy scouts. A man could survive bullets and bayonets only to fall victim to his own frozen silence on the picket line. The quirky part comes from the tricks sentries invented to survive. Some tied rags around their legs and arms, layering until they looked like makeshift mummies. Others stuffed straw into their coats, or even tucked live coals into tin cups and held them under their jackets. There are accounts of soldiers singing or reciting poems aloud just to keep blood moving and spirits awake. One Confederate joked that picket lines sounded more like choir practice than military duty, as every man hummed, chanted, or muttered just to stay conscious. Yet scholars still argue about the balance between discipline and compassion. Should officers have rotated guards more frequently to prevent cold-related casualties? Some say commanders were ruthless, enforcing long shifts regardless of conditions, believing constant vigilance was the only way to avoid surprise attacks. Others argue many officers bent the rules, shortening watches or even allowing pairs of sentries to huddle together. Was strict discipline worth the cost in frozen lives? The debate lingers, unresolved. Now picture yourself on that lonely watch. You lean on your musket, staring into the endless dark. The camp behind you is silent, only the faint glow of embers hinting at warmth. In front of you, the landscape stretches into blackness. Shadows of trees, the shimmer of snow under a pale moon, the occasional rustle of something you hope is only a rabbit. Your breath fogs in clouds that drift across your vision, briefly blinding you before vanishing into the night. Minutes drag like hours. Your fingers, curled around cold iron, go numb until you can't tell if you're holding your musket or if it's holding you. You stamp your feet, but the cold bites through boots, sending sharp shocks up your legs. The silence becomes maddening. You strain to hear movement, half expecting an enemy patrol, half praying for anything to break the monotony. Every crack of ice, every sigh of wind makes your heart jolt. The cold doesn't just test your body, it gnaws at your mind. Somewhere down the line, another sentry coughs, the sound carried by the wind like a distant signal. You want to answer, to remind yourself you're not alone, but discipline keeps your lips sealed. Instead, you shift again, trying to rub warmth back into your arms. Your jaw aches from clenching against the shivers. At one point, your eyes flutter shut, just for a moment, and terror jolts you awake, because falling asleep on duty is worse than death. Punishment is swift, and besides, the cold would gladly finish you off before the officer did. By the time your relief finally arrives, you're half frozen, half delirious. You stagger back toward camp, limbs stiff, face raw, every step feeling like walking on knives. You collapse near the fire, unable to speak at first, only groaning as the warmth stings back into your skin. Someone hands you a tin of coffee, lukewarm but heavenly, and you sip, knowing you survived another night's battle, not with the enemy across the field, but with the one that lives in the wind. And as you drift into exhausted sleep, you wonder which will claim you first in this war, the bullet or the frost. Eventually, the endless nights of tents that leak snow and guards that freeze stiff give way to something sturdier, winter quarters. After months of shivering, the order comes down: stop marching, stop fighting, dig in. Soldiers set to work like ants, felling trees, hauling logs, and hammering together crude cabins that will be home until spring thaw. The camps transform almost overnight. Where there were scattered tents and smoky fires, soon there are rows of huts, each with rough-hewn walls, mud-chinked seams, and a hole in the roof for smoke. It doesn't look like comfort, but compared to sleeping in wet canvas, it feels like a palace. The historical fact is this: both Union and Confederate armies built winter quarters during long lulls, particularly in the winters of 1862 to 63 and 1863 to 64. Soldiers cut entire forests down to create sprawling log cities, sometimes organised in neat grids, sometimes thrown together in chaotic clusters. Each hut usually slept 4 to 6 men, and the designs varied wildly. Some had dirt floors, others planks scavenged from barns. Chimneys rose from clay, stone, or just stacks of mud-packed sticks. For a few months these cabins became semi-permanent towns, complete with paths, gardens, and even makeshift theatres or chapels. The quirky part: soldiers got incredibly inventive and competitive about their huts. Men scavenged boards, glass windows, and even shingles from abandoned houses to upgrade their cabins. A Union officer in Virginia complained that his men stole entire staircases and doors from local farms, hauling them into camp like trophies. Soldiers decorated interiors with shelves, pegs, and even crude wallpaper pasted from newspapers. One Confederate bragged that his hut had a real door that swung on hinges, while his neighbour still crawled through a blanket. These weren't just shelters, they were status symbols. The better your hut, the higher your winter prestige. But scholars debate whether these quarters really improve soldiers' health. Some argue the cabins save lives by providing warmth, privacy, and a break from constant exposure. Others point out that crammed huts, smoky fires, and poor ventilation actually worsened outbreaks of disease. One historian noted that pneumonia and typhoid cases spiked during winter quarters, turning cosy cabins into incubators of sickness. Were they shelters or traps? The answer, frustratingly, seems to be both. Now imagine yourself helping to build one. You heft an axe, your breath fogging as you strike at a frozen tree. The wood creaks, splinters, and finally crashes down into the snow. Together with your comrades, you drag the logs back, shoulders burning, hands blistered. You stack them carefully, notch against notch, until the walls begin to rise. The hut takes shape slowly, a rectangle of rough wood and mud, ugly but solid. You pause, wiping sweat from your brow despite the freezing air, and for the first time in weeks, you feel like you're building rather than just enduring. When the cabin is done, you crawl inside. The air smells of sap, mud, and smoke. A small fire flickers in the corner, its heat trapped by the log walls. You stretch out on a makeshift bunk, just a pile of straw with a blanket, and it feels like heaven. The wind rattles outside, but inside it's muted, a dull whisper instead of a scream. You can almost imagine your home, lying in a drafty farmhouse instead of a battlefield. Almost. Around you the camp buzzes with pride. Men carve signs to hang over doorways: Hotel de Yankee, Palace of King Cotton, Mud Castle. They joke about charging rent or running taverns. Some plant evergreen branches outside as decoration. Others build crude chimneys tall enough to look impressive, even if they smoke horribly. For a while, winter camp feels less like an army and more like a bizarre frontier town, alive with saws, hammers, and laughter. But comfort is never perfect. The smoke from the chimney burns your eyes, the floor stays damp no matter how much straw you spread, and lice thrive in the warmth. Nights still bring coughing fits, arguments, and the ever-present chill. Yet as you settle into your bunk staring at the glowing embers, you can't deny the truth. You've traded misery and canvas for survival in logs, and in this war that counts as progress. The cabins may have given you walls, but the real genius of winter quarters was the chimneys and stoves men cobbled together inside them. Without heat, a log hut was just a wooden icebox, so soldiers turned into amateur engineers, building fireplaces out of clay, stone, or whatever scraps they could scavenge. Some of these contraptions worked brilliantly, keeping huts so warm that frost melted off the inside walls. Others were disasters, filling the cabin with choking smoke or collapsing in the night, leaving half-burned logs smouldering on the floor. You quickly learned that the line between cosy fire and blazing inferno was dangerously thin. Historically, improvised stoves and chimneys were everywhere in winter camps. Soldiers built mud and stick chimneys that leaned precariously against hut walls, or dug trenches through the cabin floor to vent smoke through a hole at the back. Others constructed iron stoves from scrap metal, or, if lucky, scavenged real cast iron stoves from abandoned houses. Some units even issued instructions for standardized camp chimneys, though in practice every hut's fire looked different. Letters from soldiers frequently mention waking to find their cabin filled with smoke so thick they had to crawl outside just to breathe. Still, the alternative, freezing, made even the worst stoves worth the risk. The quirky side, soldiers treated their stoves like prized possessions. They named them, bragged about their designs, and sometimes fought over whose chimney drew smoke best. One Union regiment held an informal contest for best fireplace, with the winner's hut dubbed the Hilton of Camp. Confederate soldiers, short on materials, often built chimneys out of mud reinforced with sticks, which had a nasty habit of catching fire. Tales circulated of entire rows of huts going up in flames after one unlucky spark. One soldier joked that the cold didn't kill them because the fire tried first, but scholars debate whether these makeshift stoves were more beneficial or hazardous. Some argue they were life-saving innovations, letting men endure months of freezing weather with minimal casualties. Others highlight the health dangers: smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide poisoning, and hut fires that destroyed whole camps. The records show both. Soldiers praised their snug fires in letters, but also recorded deadly blazes. So were these stoves a triumph of ingenuity or proof of desperation? Historians still argue over the balance. Now imagine yourself inside one of those huts. The chimney you and your comrades built out of mud and flat stones is crackling with fire, the warmth radiating across the tiny room. You sit close, your boots drying in the heat, steam curling from the damp leather. The smoke curls lazily upward, and for a moment it feels perfect, warmth at last, after weeks of shivering. But then the wind shifts, and suddenly the room fills with smoke, stinging your eyes, burning your throat, making everyone cough and curse. You throw the door flap open, letting icy air rush in, and the hut fills with a bitter mix of cold and smoke. Welcome to the miracle of Civil War engineering. Sometimes the fire betrays you worse. You've heard the stories, men waking to find their chimney collapsed, flames licking at the straw bedding. The whole hut seconds from becoming a bonfire. You've seen the ruins yourself, charred logs, smouldering ashes, a cabin reduced to nothing but smoke. The men stand outside, teeth chattering, staring at the blackened remains of their home, suddenly homeless in the middle of winter. It's terrifying and hilarious in equal measure, the kind of thing you laugh at only because you're glad it didn't happen to you. Still, when it works, it's glorious. You sit by the fire, hands stretched out, the orange glow flickering across the log walls. The smoke dances in the chimney instead of your lungs, and for once, you feel safe. Outside, the wind howls, rattling the hut, but in here the fire holds its own. You almost believe you've beaten the cold. That human ingenuity has finally outwitted winter. And even if tomorrow your chimney collapses in a cloud of smoke and curses, tonight you savour the miracle of heat. Because in this war, a working chimney isn't just comfort, it's salvation, with a crackle and a glow. The chimneys glow through the night, but even the best fire has its limits. Sometimes the cold presses in so relentlessly that men look elsewhere for warmth, sometimes in unexpected places. You glance across camp and see horses and mules standing in a circle, their breath rising in thick clouds. A few soldiers slip close, pressing themselves against the animals' flanks like children clinging to parents. It looks absurd at first, but desperation erases pride. In a winter where toes blacken and men freeze at their posts, a horse's body heat is as valuable as a dozen blankets. The historical fact is that animals were everywhere in Civil War camps. Horses pulled wagons, carried officers, and hauled artillery, while mules became the backbone of supply trains. Dogs, too, followed regiments as mascots or companions, often sleeping in tents with soldiers. In winter, these animals doubled as heaters. Men stabled their horses close to cabins, sometimes even inside with them, letting the shared warmth keep both alive. Dogs curled at the foot of bunks, their fur a small but welcome layer against the frost. Some soldiers swore their survival through brutal nights came down to a loyal animal refusing to leave their side. The quirky detail: animals weren't just tolerated, they were loved. Stories abound of regiments adopting stray dogs, teaching them tricks, or even giving them ranks. One Union regiment's dog, Jack, became famous for marching in formation and curling up by the fire at night with whichever soldier needed him most. Horses, too, earned nicknames and reputations, often treated better than some privates. One Confederate recalled wrapping his horse in his only blanket, choosing to freeze himself rather than let the animal suffer. On the flip side, some soldiers teased each other about smelling like the mule you sleep beside, proof that necessity had erased any sense of dignity. Historians still puzzle over just how much these animals mattered in terms of morale. Were they simply practical tools, mobile heaters and beasts of burden, or did they serve a deeper psychological role, offering companionship in an otherwise brutal, isolating environment? Many argue the latter, pointing to countless diary entries where men wrote more lovingly about their dogs or horses than about their commanding officers. Was warmth the goal, or was the real comfort the reminder that not every living creature in camp carried a musket? Now place yourself in that moment. It's a night so bitter your breath freezes in your beard, and no fire, no blanket seems enough. You shuffle over to the horse line, the animals shifting nervously as you approach. You press your body against one side, the heat seeping through its thick hide into your frozen chest. The horse snorts, then settles, its steady breathing a rhythm you match with your own. Your hands, stiff from cold, bury into its mane, finding life where the air itself feels dead. Nearby, a dog curls against a soldier's feet, tail thumping weakly before tucking close again. The soldier smiles in his sleep, his face softened for once, free of the tension the cold usually carves into every line. You can hear the soft sounds of animals breathing, mixing with the groans and snores of the men. It's a strange chorus, but it means life, and in this frozen camp life is rare enough to be precious. Of course, there are drawbacks. Horses shift suddenly, nearly knocking you over, or stomp their hooves dangerously close to your toes. Mules stink, and the smell clings to your clothes long after you leave their side. Dogs, beloved as they are, sometimes bring fleas or ticks that spread through bunks. But when the choice is between discomfort and death, you take the discomfort gladly. As dawn creeps in, you pull yourself away from the animal warmth and feel the chill return instantly, like an old enemy reclaiming its ground. You stamp your feet, blow on your hands, and look back at the animals, their breath still steaming in the pale light. You realize that in this war, survival often means leaning on whatever is alive and near, even if it's a mule with a temper or a dog with muddy paws, because in winter, you don't choose your comforts. You take them wherever they'll let you, even with log huts, crackling chimneys, quilts from home, and the warmth of horses pressed against your side. Winter still sometimes erupted into violence. Battles didn't entirely stop when snow fell, they just changed character. Imagine trudging into combat through knee-deep drifts, the wind whipping icy needles into your face, muskets freezing in your hands. The war didn't pause politely for the weather. If commanders saw an opportunity, they seized it, even if that meant soldiers fighting not only each other but the ice itself. The historical fact here is that several Civil War battles and skirmishes took place in freezing conditions. The Battle of Stones River, fought in Tennessee over New Year's 1863, was one of the coldest major engagements. Men described frost coating their beards and frozen bodies lying stiff across the field. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 also left soldiers enduring freezing nights in shallow trenches, some dying of exposure before a single shot was fired. Even minor skirmishes turned deadly, not just from bullets, but from the cold stealing the strength out of shivering men. The quirky detail: snow itself sometimes became a weapon. Soldiers reported muskets misfiring when powder dampened in the sleet, leading to desperate bayonet charges where the cold steel did what frozen gunpowder couldn't. In smaller clashes, men slipped on ice mid-charge, colliding with comrades in a heap that was more slapstick than military. One Union soldier even joked that half the casualties of winter were caused by slick boots, not the enemy. After Fredericksburg, stories spread of soldiers digging shallow snow trenches, huddling inside them with muskets sticking out like porcupine quills, a bizarre fusion of snowball fight and real battle. But historians still debate the wisdom of winter campaigns. Some argue commanders should have avoided cold weather offensives altogether, since weather often caused more suffering than the enemy. Others insist winter moves could catch opponents off guard, offering rare chances for surprise victories. For every Fredericksburg disaster, there were raids and maneuvers that succeeded precisely because the enemy wasn't expecting soldiers to march through snow. The scholarly question lingers: was winter combat reckless, or simply ruthless necessity? Now picture yourself stumbling into such a fight. The snow is ankle deep, clinging to your legs with every step, each breath burning as icy air fills your lungs. Your musket feels heavier than ever, the barrel rimmed with frost, the trigger stiff beneath your finger. You try to aim, but your numb hands fumble, and when you pull, the powder hisses weakly instead of firing. You curse, slam the musket butt into the ground, and charge forward, bayonet lowered, teeth gritted against both fear and cold. Around you men slip, tumble, and scramble up again. The battlefield less like a clash of armies and more like a mad scramble across frozen earth. Gunfire cracks sporadically, muffled by the snow, while smoke from the few working muskets hangs low and thick in the frigid air. You can't tell if the tears on your face are from wind, smoke, or fear. Somewhere in the chaos, a man goes down not from a bullet but from exhaustion, his body simply giving in to the cold mid-stride. When the battle ends, the silence feels heavier than the gunfire. Snow, churned red and brown, crunches underfoot as you walk among the fallen. Some lie frozen where they fell, eyes glazed over, skin pale as marble. Others still breathe faintly, their lips blue, their hands too stiff to reach for help. You want to move, to do something, but your own body aches, your own breath comes shallow. The line between survivor and casualty feels terrifyingly thin. Back at camp, stories spread quickly. Who froze? Who slipped? Who fought with frozen fingers until the end? Men laugh bitterly, shaking their heads at the absurdity of charging into battle with numb legs and half-dead muskets. And yet the orders will come again. Because in this war, the enemy is always waiting, sometimes in grey or blue, sometimes in the cold that never lets you forget who's really in charge. After a battle fought half against the enemy and half against the frost, the campfire talk turns to something stranger than muskets and rations, superstitions. Soldiers don't just curse the cold, they imagine it has a personality, a spirit, a will of its own. You sit with your comrades, bundled in blankets, and listen as stories pass from mouth to mouth about death drafts that slip into tents at night, or frost spirits that ride on the wind, picking their victims at random. It sounds ridiculous in daylight, but in the still of a winter night, when your breath fogs like ghosts and your toes ache with numbness, even the most skeptical soldier finds himself half believing. The historical fact is that Civil War soldiers carried a mix of folklore and superstition into their winter quarters. Many grew up in rural communities where old wives' tales about weather were treated as fact. They feared night air as dangerous to health, believing a cold draft could kill more surely than disease. Some wore charms, lockets, coins, even scraps of scripture, convinced they could protect against sickness and frostbite. Diaries record soldiers attributing sudden deaths in camp not just to exposure but to the curse of the cold, as though winter itself were a living adversary. The quirky side of this superstition: soldiers sometimes went to absurd lengths to trick the cold. One regiment swore by sleeping with one boot on to ward off frostbite. Another buried onions under their tents, claiming the smell would keep away death drafts. Some believed that turning your blanket inside out before sleeping brought extra warmth, as though the cloth itself held hidden powers. And then there were the tales of ice witches. Imaginary women blamed for sudden freezes, said to ride through the night spreading frost wherever they breathed. A Confederate soldier wrote, half joking, that his regiment had been bewitched into an icicle army. Historians debate how seriously these beliefs shaped soldier behaviour. Were they genuine practices born from desperation, or just jokes spun out to pass the time? Some scholars argue superstition offered comfort in an environment where men had no control over weather or illness. Others suggest the tales were more theatrical than sincere, a way of laughing at misery by personifying it. Either way, the folklore left its mark, blending fact and fancy into the strange world of Civil War winter camps. Now put yourself by that campfire. You sit hunched, the flames flickering, as a soldier swears he saw a figure in white glide past the tents last night. The frost woman come to claim another. Another man insists he heard voices in the wind, whispering curses as the temperature plunged. You laugh, but not too loudly. You don't want to tempt fate. The cold is already cruel enough without mocking whatever invisible power might be behind it. Later, in the hut, you feel a draft creep across your face. You pull your blanket tighter, muttering to yourself that it's just the wind. Still, you can't shake the idea of frost spirits sliding through the cracks in the logs. You remember the soldier who froze on picket duty, standing like a statue until dawn. Was it just weather, or something more? You roll over, pressing closer to your bunkmate, and whisper a prayer under your breath, not sure if it's to God or to the cold itself. Superstition doesn't warm you, but it gives the suffering a shape, a story. It lets you pretend there's meaning in the misery, that the cold isn't just random cruelty, but an enemy you can fight, or at least bargain with. And in a world where frostbite and pneumonia strike without warning, even a foolish story feels like a shield. So you listen, you whisper, you half believe. Because when the wind howls outside and the frost crawls under the door, it's easier to imagine an ice witch than to accept that winter itself is indifferent to whether you wake tomorrow. After nights filled with frostbite fears and whispered tales of ice witches, the camp sometimes finds its salvation not in fire or quilts, but in sound. Music drifts across the huts and tents, cutting through the cold like a warm breath. Someone pulls out a fiddle, another strums a banjo, and before long the bleak winter night transforms into a concert hall of creaks, twangs, and off-key singing. You huddle closer to the fire, your body still shivering, but your heart beats a little steadier as the music rises against the frost. The historical fact here is that music was one of the most important morale boosters in Civil War camps, especially in winter when boredom and despair crept deepest. Soldiers carried fiddles, banjos, fifes, and harmonicas, sometimes risking precious space in their knapsacks just to bring an instrument along. Songs range from patriotic anthems like Battle Cry of Freedom to ballads of longing such as Lorena. In winter quarters, regimental bands often performed evening concerts, and impromptu jam sessions broke out around campfires. Music not only passed the time, but kept spirits alive when the cold threatened to smother them. The quirky detail: music sometimes became a bridge between enemies. There are documented instances of Union and Confederate camps, stationed within earshot of each other, trading songs across frozen fields. A Union band might play Yankee Doodle, answered by Dixie from the southern side, until eventually both sides struck up a shared tune like Home, Sweet Home. Soldiers wrote that for a few minutes rifles were forgotten and both armies were just homesick men singing under the same cold stars. Other quirks included improvised instruments, cornstalk fiddles, makeshift drums, even canteens beaten like tambourines. Necessity made music out of anything that could be plucked, struck, or blown. Historians debate how much impact this music truly had on survival. Was it a practical defense against cold, distracting men from misery, or simply a psychological trick to dull the edge of suffering? Some argue music acted like medicine, reducing despair and strengthening morale in ways no blanket or ration ever could. Others point out that no amount of fiddling kept frostbite away. Men froze whether they sang or not. Still, the sheer volume of musical references in soldiers' letters suggests it mattered more than skeptics admit. Now imagine yourself in that scene. A soldier beside you tunes a fiddle, his fingers stiff but determined. The first notes squeal, awkward and sharp, but soon the melody takes shape. Another joins in on a banjo, the rhythm bouncing in cheerful defiance of the howling wind. Men begin to clap, stomping their boots against the frozen ground, their breath fogging in unison as the camp fills with sound. You find yourself singing, voice cracking from cold and exhaustion, but stronger with every verse. The song rises like a shield, and for the first time all day you forget your numb toes. The music spreads. Officers peer from their cabins, some smiling, some pretending not to notice as their feet tap in rhythm. Dogs bark along, mules flick their ears, and the camp, usually a place of coughs, curses and silence, becomes alive. Laughter bubbles between verses, jokes slip out, and even the most solemn soldier hums under his breath. The cold is still there, biting at your skin, but it feels less powerful. The sound has made it smaller, more bearable. And then, in a quiet moment, the song turns softer. A ballad of home, of wives and sweethearts, of kitchens that smell of bread and hearths that never go cold. Voices tremble, some breaking entirely as tears freeze on cheeks. The music has shifted from defiance to longing, and the silence after each verse is almost unbearable. You realise that the cold isn't just in your body, it's in the distance from everything you left behind. The music doesn't erase that ache, but it gives it shape, a tune you can carry with you into the dark. By the time the last note fades, you're still shivering, but you're not crushed. You crawl into your hut with the tune humming in your mind, wrapping tighter around you than any quilt. Tomorrow the snow will still fall, the rations will still freeze, and the fire may smoke you out. But tonight, the music gave you warmth the cold couldn't touch, and that might be enough to see you through another frozen dawn. The music still echoes in your ears when word spreads that the generals are debating their favourite winter pastime, whether to fight or sit tight. Soldiers can argue about boots, rations or chimneys all day, but only the commanders decide if you'll spend the next month building huts or slogging through snow towards some nameless battlefield. And the truth is, winter split the high command almost as much as it split your lips in the icy wind. Some officers saw the frost as nature's ceasefire. Others thought it was a perfect time to catch the enemy off guard. The historical fact is clear. Winter strategy varied wildly between commanders. George McClellan of the Union Army of the Potomac was famous, some would say infamous, for keeping his men idle in winter quarters, drilling endlessly but rarely risking a campaign until spring. On the other hand, Ulysses S. Grant in the Western Theatre was more aggressive, pushing operations through harsh weather, convinced momentum was worth the frostbite. Confederate leaders wrestled with the same questions, often choosing caution due to weaker supply lines. Some winters passed in near silence. Others erupted in desperate marches and battles fought in snow as deep as a man's knees. The quirky detail, soldiers often mocked their leaders' decisions in song and satire. Union soldiers parodied McClellan with jokes about him, waiting for better weather before lifting a sword. Confederates teased their generals by naming winter quarters after failed offensives, camp starvation, or fort misery. Sometimes commanders made speeches about how winter was no obstacle for brave men, only for their troops to mutter. Easy for him to say, he sleeps by the fire. One group of Union privates even staged a mock debate between General Snow and General Mud, declaring that both were more dangerous than any man in grey. Historians still argue about who was right, the cautious or the bold. Was McClellan's hesitation wasteful, or did it preserve his army during times when disease and frostbite could have slaughtered more men than bullets? Was Grant reckless in pushing campaigns during freezing months, or did his aggressiveness shorten the war? Some scholars insist winter quarters were essential for rest and regrouping, while others claim lost opportunities dragged the war on unnecessarily. The debate is as frosty as the weather itself, with no easy resolution. Now imagine yourself watching these decisions play out from the muddy ground of camp. 1 week you're told to keep building huts, stockpiling wood, and preparing for months of cold stagnation. The next, rumours fly that you'll be marching south tomorrow, chasing an enemy through sleet and ice. The uncertainty gnaws at you worse than the hunger. Do you dig in and make your cabin livable, or keep your pack ready to shoulder at a moment's notice? Your future is in the hands of men debating in warm headquarters while you shiver under a thin blanket. When the order finally comes, whether to march or stay, the reactions ripple through camp. If it's winter quarters, men groan at the thought of more boredom, but secretly sigh with relief that they won't be freezing on the road. If it's a winter offensive, some cheer for action, tired of stagnation, while others curse under their breath, dreading the march through snow and mud. Either way, morale rises and falls with every decision made far above your pay grade. At night, by the fire, you and your comrades speculate like politicians. You wonder aloud if your general has any idea what it feels like to sleep in boots crusted with ice, or if he's too busy studying maps by a roaring fire. Someone cracks a joke about marching straight into the sun because the commanders can't tell north from south. The laughter eases the sting, but you know deep down that no joke changes the reality. Generals argue in warmth while soldiers endure in cold. So you lie back, staring at the stars, waiting for the next order. Maybe you'll stay here until spring, building huts into log fortresses. Maybe you'll be trudging through frozen rivers tomorrow. Either way, the cold will be there, silent, merciless, and immune to strategy. Because in this war, the weather doesn't take orders, not even from a general. If the generals argue about whether to march or sit tight, the supply wagons don't care. They get stuck either way. Winter is the season when logistics collapses, and soldiers feel it first in their stomachs. You watch the roads clog with snow and mud, wagons sinking up to their axles, mules straining until they collapse. What should be a steady flow of food, blankets, and boots turns into a trickle, or worse, nothing at all. And when nothing arrives, camp life shifts from tolerating the cold to outright battling starvation. The historical fact is that supply problems plagued both sides in winter. Union armies had railroads and better infrastructure, but even their trains stalled when snow drifted across tracks or bridges froze. Confederate supply lines were even more fragile. Roads washed out, wagons broke down, and depots simply ran empty. Soldiers recorded weeks of surviving on half rations, sometimes less. At Fredericksburg in 1862, Union soldiers waited in vain for food shipments delayed by icy rivers. At Petersburg in 1864-65, Confederates were reduced to eating peas ground into paste or scavenged scraps of corn. When the wagons stopped rolling, hunger marched into camp faster than any enemy. The quirky side of supply failures? Soldiers got inventive in filling the gaps. They roasted acorns, boiled shoe leather, and ground parched corn into meal using musket butts. Some joked that their diet made them as lean as fence rails. Sutlers, the civilian merchants who followed armies, made fortunes by selling luxuries, tobacco, sugar, or whiskey at outrageous prices. Soldiers cursed them as vultures, but still lined up when they had coins. Others turned to outright thievery, raiding farms, stealing livestock, or borrowing from wagon trains when officers weren't looking. One diary tells of men cooking mule meat, claiming it tasted better than rations because at least it was warm. Historians debate how decisive these supply failures were. Some argue they were central to the Confederacy's eventual collapse. Starving men can't fight long wars. Others emphasize morale, pointing out that soldiers with empty bellies were far more likely to desert or fall ill, especially in winter quarters. Still others downplay it, suggesting soldiers always found a way to scrape by. The truth likely lies in the middle. Supply failures didn't always kill armies outright, but they wore men down night by night, spoonful by spoonful. Now imagine yourself waiting for the wagons. You stand at the edge of camp, eyes fixed on the frozen road, stomach aching as you pray for the sound of wheels. Hours pass. Nothing. When the quartermaster finally appears, he announces that the train was delayed again. You shuffle back to your hut, gnawing on the last crust of hardtack you've saved. The crumbs stick in your throat, dry as dust, and you wash them down with water so cold it burns your teeth. That night the camp feels heavier than usual. Fires burn low, men sit silent, and the usual jokes die on their lips. Hunger isn't funny anymore. You hear your buddy mutter about sneaking off to a nearby farm, and someone else talks about boiling old beans again, even though they've sprouted mould. You think about the letters you wrote home, promising family you were fed and strong, and wonder whether to admit the truth in the next one. By the second day without resupply, desperation turns louder. Men curse the wagons, curse the officers, curse the weather itself. A few slip away in the night, hoping to find food before their bodies give out. The cold bites harder when your stomach is empty. It feels sharper, crueler, a reminder that every layer of your being is running on nothing. Even the fire seems weaker, its glow too thin to fight the gnaw inside you. And then, finally, the wagons arrive. You rush with the others, stomach growling, only to find the barrels half empty, the pork frozen solid, the coffee beans reduced to a handful. Still you grab your share, clutching it like treasure. The meal that night isn't much, a few bites of meat, a hard cracker softened in weak broth, but it feels like a feast. You eat slowly, savouring every mouthful, because tomorrow the wagons might not come. So you learn to live between deliveries, scraping by on ingenuity, theft and luck. The supply line is your lifeline, and when it breaks, the cold presses closer, reminding you that hunger is just another weapon winter wields. If Union soldiers grumbled about wagons bogged in snow, Confederate soldiers knew something worse: wagons that never came at all. For the Southern armies, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was catastrophic. You look around a Confederate camp in late 1863 or 1864, and it's a picture of desperation. Men wrapped in scraps of blankets, barefoot in snow, gnawing on whatever pitiful ration they've scrounged. The Confederacy's industrial weakness, already a burden, became a winter sentence. While the Union had factories and railroads, the South had broken tracks, dwindling farms, and a government that could barely keep up with paper promises. The historical fact here is stark. By the later winters of the war, Confederate armies were chronically undersupplied. Clothing was scarce. Blankets and coats were almost mythical. Many soldiers marched with feet wrapped in rags or stuffed into shoes made of canvas and wood. Food shortages became routine: cornmeal, dried peas, and the occasional sliver of bacon if luck held. The winter of 1864-65, especially during the Siege of Petersburg, was described by Confederates themselves as a season of starvation. Soldiers deserted in droves, not because they lost faith in the cause, but because hunger and cold simply hollowed them out. The quirky detail: Confederate civilians sometimes tried to ease the burden by sending comfort boxes, but what arrived could be as strange as it was helpful. A package might contain homespun mittens alongside jars of pickled peaches, or scarves knitted from dog hair because wool was gone. In some towns, women organised sock rallies, gathering to knit hundreds of pairs in a single night. One story tells of soldiers so desperate they roasted shoe leather and chewed it like jerky, joking that it was Confederate beef. Humour, thin as it was, kept them from despairing completely. Historians debate whether the suffering of Confederate soldiers was primarily the result of poor logistics or the Union's deliberate strategy of destruction. Some argue Southern leaders failed to organise efficient supply lines, leaving men to starve even when resources existed. Others point to Union campaigns that deliberately targeted railroads, crops, and livestock, ensuring Confederate armies went into winter hungry. Either way, the consensus is grim. By the final winters, the Confederacy could not keep its soldiers clothed or fed, and the cold became as effective an enemy as any Union regiment. Now put yourself in one of those camps. You crouch beside a fire made from half-burned fence rails, pulling your rag-wrapped feet closer to the flames. Your belly growls, but the only food left is a handful of cornmeal cooked into a paste so bland it barely tastes like anything. The men around you gnaw on scraps, coughing in the smoke, their eyes sunken from hunger. You hear someone mutter that he'd give his musket for a loaf of bread, and you believe him. The nights are the hardest. You lie in a hut with no blanket, pressed against your comrades for warmth, but still shivering so badly your teeth ache. Your stomach twists in hunger, making sleep impossible. The wind howls through cracks in the walls, and you wonder if tomorrow you'll have the strength to march, or even to rise. Desertion whispers in the back of your mind. Home is miles away, but at least it has food. At least it has warmth. You're not sure if your cause is worth freezing into a corpse no one will remember. And yet, somehow, the camp clings together. Jokes are cracked about Confederate coffee made from acorns or sweet potatoes. Someone pulls out a harmonica and wheezes out a tune, and for a moment laughter bubbles through the misery. You watch men who look half dead still muster the strength to smile, and it's both heartbreaking and inspiring. By dawn, the cold hasn't relented, the rations haven't improved, and the wagons still haven't arrived. You rise slowly, joints stiff, body hollow. You shoulder your musket with hands that tremble more from hunger than fear. You're fighting two wars now, one against the Union and one against the cold that seems determined to erase you. And in truth, you're not sure which war will end you first. While Confederates scraped by on cornmeal mush and rag-wrapped feet, Union soldiers, though hardly comfortable, often fared better. You walk through a northern winter camp and the difference is obvious. More wool coats, sturdier boots, blankets enough to go around. Fires burn hotter because wood keeps arriving on wagons, and the smell of coffee drifts through the air. It's not luxury by any stretch, but compared to the South's starvation camps, Union winter quarters feel almost livable. The North's advantage wasn't just muskets and manpower, it was railroads and factories, humming even in the dead of winter. The historical fact is that Union logistics, while imperfect, vastly outstripped the Confederacy's. Railroads delivered food, clothing and coal to depots, which then moved supplies forward by wagon. Northern soldiers grumbled about frozen rations and lousy boots, but statistically, they received more consistent provisions than their southern counterparts. Mail service was steadier too, meaning packages from home, blankets, socks, and even jars of preserves reached camps more often. This logistical machine kept Union armies fed and clothed, even when snow-blocked roads and ice-covered rivers, a silent weapon just as decisive as any cannon. The quirky detail? Abundance sometimes bred absurdity. Northern camps recorded mountains of hardtack piling up, so much that soldiers used extra crackers as playing cards or building blocks. Some units received barrels of pickles, leading to weeks of pickle rations until everyone was sick of the sight of them. In other cases, supplies misfired. One regiment was delivered dozens of boxes of gloves but no socks, leading soldiers to wear mittens on their feet. Another famously received crates of women's hoop skirts, the result of a bureaucratic mix-up, and soldiers donned them over trousers for warmth, marching through camp like a parade of frozen debutantes. Historians debate how much this logistical edge shortened the war. Some argue Northern abundance allowed armies to grind forward relentlessly, wearing down Confederate forces who were freezing and starving. Others note that Union soldiers still suffered plenty. Supply trains broke down, shoes wore out, and disease killed men in every camp no matter how well stocked. The real advantage, some scholars suggest, wasn't individual comfort, but sustainability. The North could afford long winters of inactivity without collapsing. The South could not. Now imagine yourself in a Union winter hut. The fire flickers in a proper iron stove, scavenged from a farmhouse and installed neatly in the corner. Your coat is thick wool, issued by the quartermaster, and while your boots are cracked, they still keep the worst of the cold out. On the table lies a letter from home, tucked beside a package containing socks knitted by your sister and a tin of cookies that, though stale, taste like heaven. You're still cold, still tired, but compared to the stories drifting in from Confederate lines, you almost feel guilty for how much better off you are. Outside, supply wagons creak into camp, unloading barrels of beans and boxes of coffee. Men cheer, rushing to grab their portions, cracking jokes about the monotony of the food but eating gratefully all the same. Fires blaze higher that night, coffee steams in tin cups, and the camp hums with voices lifted in song. You hear rumours about Confederate soldiers eating mule meat, and you shake your head, not sure whether to pity them or feel grateful for your side's abundance. Yet comfort has its drawbacks. Some soldiers grow complacent, grumbling loudly over small inconveniences. The beans are cold, the hardtack is stale, forgetting that men only a few miles away would kill for such rations. Others grow restless, boredom gnawing harder than hunger ever could. Idle time in a well-fed camp can turn sour, leading to gambling, drunkenness, and fights that break out simply because men have nothing else to do. Survival is easier, but discipline becomes its own battle. Still, as you crawl into your bunk that night, the blanket heavy over your shoulders, you know the truth. The Union's ability to keep you fed and clothed might be the single most important advantage you have. Muskets and cannons may win battles, but railroads and warehouses win winters. And every winter endured brings the war a little closer to ending. Winter eventually loosens its grip, though it never truly lets go. One morning you step outside the hut, and instead of biting air you smell mud. Snow melts into brown rivers that snake through camp, turning paths into bogs and burying boots up to the ankles. The frost still lingers on branches, but the first shoots of green poke through, fragile yet stubborn. Spring is coming, and with it, the end of this strange season of waiting. You survived, though survival feels like a word stretched too thin. Half victory, half exhaustion. The historical fact is that as soon as spring thaw arrived, armies stirred back into motion. Winter quarters were abandoned almost overnight. soldiers packing up blankets, stoves, and even stolen furniture to haul back onto the march. Campaign seasons began in earnest once roads dried, and generals wasted no time ordering movements and offensives. Surviving the winter wasn't just about staying alive, it was about being fit to fight when the thaw arrived. Men too sick, too frostbitten, or too worn down often didn't return to the ranks at all. Winter was a filter, and spring revealed who had passed through it. The quirky side of this seasonal shift. Soldiers often held mock funerals for their winter quarters, staging processions as they abandoned huts they had poured so much effort into. Some named their cabins like old friends, the Mud Palace, Hotel Frostbite, and left graffiti carved into walls for whoever might stumble across them later. Others burned their huts deliberately, setting fires that roared across camps as a final farewell. One Union soldier wrote that watching the huts burn was like watching months of misery go up in smoke, and he meant it as a blessing. Historians debate the psychological impact of these transitions. Did winter harden soldiers into veterans, forging resilience that carried them through future campaigns? Or did it drain them so badly that spring marches began with weakened, half-broken men? Some scholars argue winter was the great equalizer, a teacher harsher than any drill sergeant. Others insist it was simply wasted time. Soldiers grew lazy, sick, and demoralized, leaving commanders to whip them back into shape once the thaw came. The debate captures the dual nature of winter. It destroyed some, but it steeled others. Now imagine yourself walking out of camp as spring begins. The huts you slaved over lean, half-collapsed, their chimneys crumbling, smoke still staining the logs. The mud sucks at your boots as you march, each step a reminder that warmth brings its own miseries. Birds call from thawed trees, a sound so alien after months of silence that it almost startles you. Ahead, the roads stretch long and wet, but at least they stretch forward. The war will move again, and so will you. The men around you talk of home, of food they hope to find in the next town, of battles rumoured on the horizon. Some grin, eager to leave behind the stink of winter. Others trudge silently, eyes hollow, carrying more ghosts than gear. You look back once, watching the camp fade behind a haze of smoke and mist, and feel a strange mixture of relief and loss. Miserable as it was also a place where you endured, where you lived through nights that should have killed you. The hut, the fire, the quilt, they were your world, and now that world is gone, but the march waits for no one. You shoulder your pack, grip your musket, and press forward into the mud. Winter is ending, but war is not. The cold has taught you its lessons, carved scars into your body and memory, and now it hands you over to the next season. You don't know if you're stronger for it or simply worn down, but you know this much. You're still here. And in this war, sometimes that's the greatest triumph of all. And now, after marching with those soldiers through 25 frozen chapters, we finally step away from the campfires, the mud huts, and the endless nights of rattling wind. You've seen the ways they fought back against the cold, quilts stitched with love, chimneys that smoked and sometimes exploded, snowball battles that bruised and healed at once, and the simple warmth of bodies pressed together like firewood. You've smelled the pork stiff as bricks, heard the coughs in canvas tents, and felt frostbite creeping up your own toes as you stood watch in the dark. The cold wasn't a background detail of the Civil War. It was an enemy as fierce and cunning as any general. As you think back, maybe you notice how much of survival came down not to muskets or bayonets, but to little acts of stubbornness. A fiddle played at midnight, a dog curled against a soldier's feet, or a letter scratched onto half-frozen paper. Those moments didn't win battles, but they kept men alive until battles returned. That, in its own way, was victory. And while historians argue over whether winter was a killer or a teacher, the truth for the soldiers themselves was simpler. You endured, or you didn't. If you did, you carried the frost inside you forever. Tonight, though, you don't have to march or freeze. You can just let the story drift away, knowing that thousands of men once fought this same fight against the air itself, and somehow left behind tales vivid enough to reach you now. So ease back, loosen your shoulders, and let your own body relax in a way theirs rarely could. The fire is fading, the camp is quiet, and the snow outside your window, if there's any at all, belongs only to the world of dreams.